Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ministry Mondays with Meg. I'm Meg. I am Reverend Meg Biddle, and I serve as the National Coordinator for Ministry Life. And I have the privilege of being the host of this podcast, this web show. And I'm just grateful for this opportunity. So thank you for everybody for watching and for listening. Today, I'm really excited about my guest. I know I say that a lot, but I am. I am excited about my guest. He's written a fantastic book. Please welcome Reverend Curtis Paul DeYoung, who's author of The Risk of Being Woke, Sermonic Reflections for Activists, and also the co-CEO of the Minnesota Council of Churches. That is an incredibly long. Anyway, thank you so much, Reverend Curtis, for joining me today and talking about your book and about you. So let's start with who you are for people who don't know you. Let's talk about a little bit about who you are, what you do, that kind of stuff, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Meg, and for this invitation to be on Ministry Mondays. Very much looking forward to this conversation today. I'm here in Minneapolis, sitting in my home office. My wife and I live 10 blocks from where George Floyd was killed. And that shapes a lot of the work that I've done, the writing of the book, which we'll get to later. But I'm presently the co-CEO of the Minnesota Council of Churches, became co at the beginning of this year, and share that with the presiding elder of the AME church here. And she and I are together leading the Council of Churches in this season. I've been in this role 6 years. Prior to that, I was in Chicago for a while at the Community Renewal Society, a historic racial justice organization there in Chicago. Before that, I was a professor at Bethel University of Reconciliation Studies. And before that, did some nonprofit work and was a pastor of a local church here in Minneapolis. I grew up in Michigan. Meg and I were schooled together at the same location in Anderson, Indiana, Anderson University, and seminary at Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C., and have done ministry both in New York City and in Washington, D.C. in the early part of my career. Married for almost 40 years, 3 children, adult children, and glad to be here with you today.
That's quite the resume. I mean, really, what a life. That's amazing. So how did you get involved in race reconciliation, all these different avenues of ministry? How did that happen?
Sure. Well, the denomination that I grew up in, the Church of God, which is based in Indiana, has within its sort of holiness tradition a commitment to racial reconciliation, or they would call it unity. Racial unity would be the language that was used historically. And so that was taught to me growing up. I didn't see it very often. Often our theology doesn't match up with our actual practice. Especially for a denomination that's been around for a while. But that was there in the DNA, I think, from the beginning. But I was raised in very white contexts. My father was a pastor first in a rural Indiana and then in suburban Michigan. And the high school I graduated from near Kalamazoo, Michigan, was, I would say, 99% white. I went to Anderson University. When I was at Anderson University, it was about 95% white. Then I moved to New York City to work at a homeless shelter in Times Square called Covenant House. And it was a Catholic-run shelter, and joined their faith community and went to Mass every day. And after a few months, I wanted to find something for Sunday mornings that was more familiar to me. So I visited a church of my own denomination, not knowing my way around New York, went north in Manhattan and found myself in Harlem. As most folks know, is a historic cultural mecca for African American folks. And little did I know when I walked into the church that morning that this was a church that was 100% African American and had not seen a white person into those doors in several years, not even in officials of our denomination. And I was welcomed in by the usher and escorted up to the front of the church to sit. And then it began to dawn on me where I had arrived. I stayed in the service, and what I didn't understand about the culture of the church and many African American churches, and perhaps other churches as well, is that they had a lay-led pre-service called the devotional service, and that's what was occurring when I arrived. And the pastor was still in his office. So after sitting there for about 5 minutes, I was summoned to the pastor's office because the pastor had heard that I had arrived. And that was an unusual thing. And I was 22 years old at the time. And so I went into the pastor's office, and he was very warm. He was from South Carolina, so he had a warm kind of Southern cultural way about him, and found out that I went to Anderson University to school. And when I was at Anderson as a student, our campus pastor and New Testament professor was Dr. James Earl Massey, who was a noted
Dr. Massey, yeah,
preacher and a friend of the pastor. So when he found out that I had studied under Dr. Massey, I guess I was in. And so then he said, can you preach for me? Well, first he said, are you a minister? And I was licensed, not yet ordained, but licensed. And then he opened his calendar and asked me if I could preach 2 weeks from then. I'd only had, preached maybe 5 or 6 sermons in my life as a youth pastor. And 2 weeks later, I would be back there to preach. But that year in New York transformed me in many ways. One, what I did not understand was he was a seasoned pastor in his late 50s and had no young pastors. Many Black churches and other churches that don't necessarily have resources to send all of their folk to seminary have also an apprenticeship style prep for young ministers. And he had no young ministers. So he saw me, and while he saw I was white, he saw that I was young and needed to be apprenticed. And so he took me under his wing. And so I spent the year there, and he had me preach on average once a month on Sunday morning. He was a pastor who loved to preach, but he was equipping me. And of course, the congregation taught me how to preach in that particular setting.
What a gift that is.
Yes.
So you still had the traditional call and response and all. Oh.
I had to learn that, of course, because that was not a part of my upbringing. So I had to learn how to pause. Yeah. I had to learn how to be extemporaneous, but it was an amazing kind of gift at such a young age. And then just to learn the ways of the Black community in New York, and of course, much of the congregation was from the South, so it was kind of a wonderful education in life in Black church in New York.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up very similar to your whole, the middle of a cornfield in Indiana,
right?
The very white American Baptist Church, and yeah, that really limits your worldview. And yes, we talked of justice was part of our,
right,
but you didn't see it. You didn't hear it really. I mean, if we're honest, you just didn't. And so I am grateful for people along the way who open your eyes to see the world differently than you see it, in that little tiny polarized community that so often we end up in. That's what an amazing experience for you.
So that
I
sort of set my life in a new direction. And just to kind of complete the preparation for ministry, after a year there, I decided I needed to go to seminary.
That's when you went to seminary.
And
Okay.
I went back to Anderson, and I know you also graduated the seminary there. This was the early 1980s, and Dr. Massey was the only Black professor at the seminary. So I, of course, took all his classes, but realized that they were not going to prepare me for the kind of urban multicultural context I was feeling called toward. So I it applied and was accepted at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, but stopped by Washington, D.C. for the summer at another Black church in our denomination, pastored by a gentleman by the name of Samuel Hines, who was Jamaican. And the congregation is about 50% Jamaican, 50% African American. And I always have to be honest in these conversations. I always, you want to have some sort of great story where the heavens opened and God spoke. But I met a young woman in the congregation who got a hold of my heart and is now my wife. And I said, there must be a seminary in Washington, D.C. I can go to see if this relationship is going to go anywhere. And this was a Black church in Washington, D.C. So they took me over to the Black seminary, the HBCU seminary, Howard University in Washington, D.C. And a couple of the pastors were graduates there, introduced me to the dean. And the dean had previously been a dean at Union Theological Seminary, of all things. So he welcomed me in. And so my theological education was in a historic Black context of Howard University.
Well, really, the heavens opened up and introduced you to your wife. So just take the story that way. I mean,
that's right.
It's still a beautiful story, whether it was God spoke to you and or God said, here's a beautiful woman, to be your partner on this journey. Wow, that's I would just read your life story. I mean, that would just be it's reflections from that are just lovely. So then you've gone to Howard.
Right.
You've gone from little bitty Indiana, all in a box, to now the world looks different and you're seeing everything in new ways, and you're introduced into a community. Wow. What was that? What was that like? Were you welcome? Did they look at you like, dude, you don't belong here? I mean,
well, in the 1980s, being an interracial couple had its challenges. So what I learned to do when I would send my resume to different churches that were looking for a pastor is I'd put a picture of the two of us with the resume, and then I just wouldn't hear from the folks that had a problem with that because we had some encounters that were unpleasant in that regard. Unexpectedly, there was a church here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that was interested, and they were in a neighborhood that was becoming multiracial, and they actually saw our marriage as an advantage. And so we ended up coming here, which in God's sense of humor, to one of the whitest places in the country as far as major cities go. And then, of course, our snow adds another aspect to the whiteness here. And so that's how we ended up here in Minneapolis. But an interesting conversation occurred before I left Howard University. One of my professors, whose name was Dr. Calvin Morris, had been a colleague of Martin Luther King, and by this time, I'd been on King's staff in Chicago, and by this time was teaching at the seminary, and he did an exit interview with me. And he said, "You probably want to stay here in a context like Howard. I mean, in a Black context, and because you've been here now and you appreciate this." He says, "But we've been equipping you to go back into white contexts and do work around addressing racism in white contexts." And he says, "You need to stay connected to the Black church, of course, for community and for sustenance, etc. But we need you to go back into white community." So the move to Minneapolis, when I reflected on it later, made sense given sort of his, I guess, prophetic remarks over my life. And that has been fairly consistent through the work. And then, of course, in these last few years with the killing of George Floyd, never would I have dreamed that that would have occurred here in Minneapolis.
So was it the murder of George Floyd? Was it the life experience? Is it just all of it that brought you to this place where you're like, I have to write this book? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously my journey has been one around racial justice and owning the various aspects of whiteness and calling out the complicity of the church and all of this, and doing that here in this context as well as in relationship with others in other parts of the country. But certainly in the last some years, with videotaping of racist policing that we see in so many parts of our country, this has become much more of a central issue. So I'd spent a few years in Chicago and then came back to Minneapolis for this position. And Chicago, while I was there, Laquan McDonald was killed, and the then mayor, Rahm Emanuel, hid the video until he got reelected. And so I was really introduced to some of those issues in a Chicago kind of way, and then came back with that kind of set of glasses on to view what was happening here in a fresh perspective. And, you know, George Floyd was not the first Black person killed by police in Minneapolis, but the timing of it, as we all know, was in the midst of a pandemic where we were all at home, and watching our televisions, and that video became imprinted on our psyche. And then the protests that erupted then became a worldwide event, as well as a Minneapolis event, and the racial reckoning. So out of that time, and somewhat prior, again, maybe even as early, certainly as early as Ferguson protests and stuff, I began to take the preaching that I was taught at Howard and at the church in New York, which is a preaching that speaks to the issues that we face. And it means if something happens, you change your sermon on Sunday morning to address the current event that happens. And that had to become more razor sharp around racial justice issues. And as you know, the head of the Minnesota Council of Churches, we were often called to have voice on these issues as well. So the sermons, which have been turned into reflections in this book, come out of that season of the last, I'd say 10 years, kind of post-academic life, being back in the streets, in pulpits, having to preach about these issues, and knowing that others have the same challenges, have to go into the pulpit and know how to preach. So,
and I imagine living where you live and being a husband and a father, there's the fear for your own family and their safety.
Of course, yeah. I have children that are, considered Black in the society, biracial children, 2 of them are sons. So certainly feel that firsthand. And my wife is a Black woman navigating these spaces. And right in the first days after the death of George Floyd, as there was a lot of protest and unrest, we had a number of white supremacists arrive in town from different parts of the state of Minnesota or from the country. And one day we were in the front yard, and what they would do is they would drive these cars that they'd taken the license plates off of. And one came by and stopped and saw my wife and started writing notes in his notebook. And we were like, wow, you know, what's going to happen because of this? And we knew that people were being attacked and that houses were being lit up. And so, yeah, it became very real in that moment, as well as, you know, the daily kind of realities. So certainly, as a white person, I have privilege, and I am to some degree protected from that kind of direct racism. But as like anyone who's in relationship with folks of color and is really listening to their stories and observing what's going on, and you have kind of a window in to the effects of racism.
I don't want to give all of the book away because I actually want people to buy it and read it. And you can do that, folks, at judsonpress.com. That's judsonpress.com. I will put a link to Judson's website in the show notes. But there's just so much that is in here, and of course you have all the wonderful names of everyone from Fred Craddock, you know, because how can you not love Fred Craddock? But did you write this book with preachers in mind? Who did you write this book for?
These were sermons that, or parts of sermons that I adapted into reflections to try but retain the sermonic feel to them, because I think that's important. So certainly preachers, but also folks who are activists, folks who are out in the streets, you know, raising our consciousness around these issues, lay leaders, teachers. I think just folks who are trying to see how their faith and their commitment to justice intersects are people who can read this book and benefit from it. I also wanted to showcase, if I can use that term, the way I learned biblical scholarship at Howard University.
Sure, absolutely.
So my professors brought a Black perspective to scripture and to thinking. And when I left Howard, I continued to read those scholars and the growing number of scholars in the African American community. But I also began to read scholars in Asian American or global Asian folk, Native Indigenous folk, Latinx folk, Palestinian folk. You know, I just wanted to read a broader. So my goal when I look at a text is to get as many perspectives on that as possible. So where this book didn't require footnotes, I put footnotes in there so that folk could see who I borrowed or got this idea from, who's a part of that kind of a cloud of witnesses, as it were, in the work of creating sermons or reflections. And I think it gives hope to those of us who are come out of one context, mine coming out of a white context, that you can read widely and begin to gain insights. And many congregations now are becoming more and more multiracial or multicultural, and you need that ability to speak to a variety of experiences. But our congregations have always been diverse by class, gender, LGBTQ, etc. There's always been diversity, and we need, as much as possible, to bring the stories of all of our congregants. And then you add to that now a generation of young people that are not in our congregations that we still have to be able to speak to and reach to and work together with for justice.
Do you think that if we were truly more focused on justice within our churches, that would be more appealing to our younger people? Do you think that would actually draw them in, or does the church, just as it currently functions, need to die and see new life, a new way? I know I didn't ask you about this ahead of time, but it just popped in my head, so I thought I'd go there.
Sure. I think that that would definitely be a draw. I'm not sure our role is to try to get young people into the buildings. Our role is to go out where they are and build those kinds of sort of congregations in real life and see where it goes from there. But we need to have a faith that speaks to the issues that young people care about, that they experience. And there has to be an honest kind of faith. I've also felt that, and this is one of the ways that a white image of Jesus, being the dominant image of Jesus, has really harmed us, in that, anyone that reads scripture closely and knows the stories of the Bible, knows the time from which it came and where it came, knows that Jesus was not white. So it seems to be almost like if you're portraying Jesus as white, well, what else are you lying about? So, there's kind of a need for a kind of honesty and commitment to truth in that sense. And that's an example of it.
That's exactly what I was looking for, or I was hoping for, that kind of answer, because, and I feel the same way. It's not about drawing them into the building. It's about relationship and, being the church in the world, ministering with your community. And we've read the statistics. Young people are dying, older people too, but young people are dying to be included, to be heard, to be valued, and on top of all of our racial inequalities and everything else going on. But it is just, you want to make a difference so badly, and I think it's just sometimes incredibly difficult to even figure out how to start. So I am so grateful for you and the journey that God has taken you on, and for you sharing that with people, because it's so important. It's so important. The risk of being woke. One of the many things I underlined in there is in the beginning, where you say we are at risk when we are awake, when we are woke, when we work for racial and social justice, and when we align ourselves with Jesus. And then you just go on and on and on, because I feel like some people would write something like that, but then they would stop there. They don't go far enough, and you keep going. And I am grateful, and I would love for people to read this and see what they think about the Lazarus. Start with the Lazarus, and if you are a preacher, of a Bible scholar, are you going to preach it the same way the next time after you read the book? Because I don't think you can, or at least I don't think you should. At least that's how I felt about the book. What did you learn? Was there a big lesson, aha moment in writing the book?
I'm sure there were a few. Certainly the Lazarus story, which is kind of the anchor start where the title comes from. When I had read that so many times, that story, and missed the fact that when Lazarus was raised from the dead, woken up, because Jesus said he's asleep, I got to go wake him up, that he also had a death threat on his life. I had missed that somehow, but it made me think then about those of us who feel a calling to do the work of justice from a faith Jesus-inspired perspective, also experience threats, whether they be physical or psychological or spiritual, and we feel the stress of being woke. And I love this term woke. It comes from African-American context originally, and I found it as far back as the 1930s. It may go even farther back than that in Black community, that when you were to be woke, you were to be aware that racism exists around every corner. And so be careful, be awake, be alert, be woke. As I was writing the book, that language came to me. I think it's always caution for those of us who are white not to appropriate language or things from other cultural contexts. But it just fits so nicely with the Lazarus story, because Jesus used the language of being asleep, woke, uses it in some of the other places where he raises someone from the dead as well. But then, of course, popular culture took this on, and little did I know when this book was published that wokeness, wokeology, all these different variations on woke would become the language of politicians to try to quiet or insult or whatever folks who are working on justice issues. And so it's become even more important in this season where this kind of language is being used. The anti-racism author Ibram X. Kendi has said that woke is now the new N-word to use against and discredit justice folk. And so call them woke. In previous generations, you would have used the N-word. I think that's really powerful and startling, and why we need to claim this and step into it.
Yeah, I mean, my first reaction when I read the title was kind of a, really? I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But then you go, well, I know Cheryl Price, the author, our editor of Judson Press, and I trust. And then you read the book, and then you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. But you do when you have that sort of visceral reaction to it, like, oh, do I really want to read this book? But you do. You do, folks, listeners, viewers, read the book. Read the book. We could go on and on about this forever. And who knows? There might be part 2 down the road. Okay. Do you see yourself writing more? Is this the first for you?
I've written several books.
Okay.
And I started, my first book came out in 1995, and it was on Judson Press, called Coming Together, the Bible's Message in an Age of Diversity. And it took that learning that I mentioned earlier at Howard, around the African presence in the Bible and the Black perspective on the Bible. And it took that and added the various other kind of cultural, racial perspectives on the Bible. And then I've done some work on reconciliation perspectives and social justice activism. And this is the first, my first couple of books I wrote as a solo author. And then I wrote a number of books in collaboration, because I think when you address issues of diversity, equity, racial justice, it's the kind of multiracial writing team or various perspectives, multi-gendered teams just bring quite a perspective. So this is the first solo author book I've written in some time. And obviously the sermon comes from the preacher, so there's a certain personal aspect to it. So yeah, I'm sure I'll keep writing something.
I look forward to it.
I do have to write a whole lot of new sermons now because they're published, so I have to preach some fresh material.
Right.
Preachers, which local pastors have to do all the time, but those of us that don't sit in a local church don't have that same pressure. But I look forward to that as well.
Okay. So as we sort of wrap this up, the joy question.
Sure.
So everything that you do, think about all that you do in your life and what brings you joy.
Yeah, it's nice you give us advance notice on this question so we can reflect a bit on it.
That is the one I do warn people about because it's an important question.
Yeah. So I think related to the work, it's when you actually see, get a glimpse of the reality of reconciliation, that it is possible, that we can live beyond these ways that society defines us and separates us. It's often work to do that, but it's good work. But when you have those moments where you just kind of feel, Howard Thurman used to write about how we usually don't experience our lives other than as Black people or white people. But there are that moments where we experience ourselves as humans, where we kind of, without losing our whiteness and Blackness, obviously we step into this kind of piece. So that's a time that brings joy, when those moments, obviously my family is a key source of my joy. And I know others have said this as well on your podcast, but I'm a beach person. And so the place of peace for me is at the beach. Oceans. I live in Minnesota. We got 10,000 lakes, but none of them are an ocean. So I do walk the lakes here as much as I can, but whenever I can, and I can get to an ocean. And so my favorite beaches and oceans are in Cape Town, South Africa, in Guadeloupe, and then I like the beaches along the Gulf, particularly the Gulf Shores in Alabama, which is where I wrote the proposal for this book. So
okay. Well, what a joy it has been to chat with you, to read your book. Again, everyone, The Risk of Being Woke, for our listeners. I'm holding up a copy of Reverend Curtis Paul DeYoung's book, with the foreword by Mama Iva. Iva Carruthers. And it's available at judsonpress.com. I'll put the link in the notes. And I'm just so grateful for you to take the time to chat with me, share a little bit about your life and your story, and look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a joy to hang out with you today.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. And for all those listening and watching, we thank you for being a part of this, and catch us next time, next Monday. We're on Facebook, Spotify, all those fun places, YouTube. Just Google Ministry Mondays with Meg, you'll find us. But we thank you for your support. Thanks for listening, and